Okay, thank you so much. I'm glad to be back again. I was here 23. I'm delighted for the opportunity to present. I know the title is about the expression of both autistic in your program, autistic and psychotic experiences, but given the time I have, I will be focusing only on autism. I have no disclosures. I would like to apologize in advance if I use a term that may not align with your worldview. We already heard that you cannot use the word typically developing. I think it's an important disclaimer to make. I'm going to be talking really about the relationship between autism and psychosis and schizophrenia more specifically. Autism obviously is a condition that co-occurs with many other conditions. But why psychosis in particular? There is the idea that if you want to understand a particular phenomena, you need to recognize its counterpoint. And we think that autism and psychosis present that type of dichotomy. In medicine, there are conditions that might be diametric, and we'll talk about that. But first, the relationship between autism and schizophrenia goes over about 100 years old, since the time that Gronia Sakharova in 1924 talked about autism. And people characterize this relationship along three different models. The first model, which I think is still the reigning model, the most dominant model, is the independent model, which basically says that autism and schizophrenia are two independent conditions. And rightly so, what we have here is that two conditions that might have different ages of onset. They will have different symptomology. We have different conferences for autism and schizophrenia. We even have a professional divide where basically autism seems to be privy to child psychology and child psychiatry, and schizophrenia tend to be privy to adult psychiatry. So there's very minimal talk, and this idea of separation started from the DSM-3 in 1980, which I think led to some unintended consequences, that it did minimize that crosstalk, which I think may have slowed down our ability to understand the relation between autism and schizophrenia. With the advent of genome-wide association studies and comparative studies between autism and schizophrenia in the 2000s, people came with the idea that there are actually overlapping conditions, with the recognition that may have common risk factors, both of them are of neurodevelopmental origin, and they may have similar impairments such as social deficits. And this is a nice paper by Jotla et al. 22 that basically summarize the areas where there are shared phenotypes, including genetics. And these are the areas where seem to be specific to autism versus areas that are specific to schizophrenia or psychosis in general. There is a third model. It's called the diametric model. The diametric model was first started in about 1999, 2000, when I recognized that looking at the research of TheorMind that was done in schizophrenia and autism. Mind you, around that time, there was only a few papers in schizophrenia that looked at the ability of TheorMind, which is the ability to attribute mental states. And I came to a recognition that these two conditions might fail a TheorMind task, but they do actually fail for different reasons. And I came with the suggestion that perhaps TheorMind with autism at the time might be associated with an ability to generate hypotheses about other person's mental states, whereas in schizophrenia, it's the over-attribution, over-mentalizing that basically categorizes TheorMind performance in people with schizophrenia. With this idea that there was basically picked up later in 2008 by two scientists, Crispy, he's a geneticist, Badcock is a philosopher. He's actually the last patient of Anna Freud, which is really interesting. And what they came up with is they used the idea of genomic imprinting. Genomic imprinting is basically parent-specific gene expressions in order for normal development to actually take hold and develop. And what they found is that there are certain conditions that when this genomic imprinting does not go as well or as planned, you have conditions that might be enriched in autism and some other condition might be enriched with psychosis. Importantly, that the imprinting happens at the same genetic locus that is associated with this particular condition. So this is basically a diagram that Crispy has kindly provided, suggesting that there are certain phenotypes that might be characteristics of schizophrenia. These might be characteristics of autism. And the key issue here is that basically that you have these genetic liabilities or predisposition to either autism or schizophrenia, when they hit a particular balance, you will not have either autism or schizophrenia. So basically, in their model, is that the balance between genetic or risk factors for autism psychosis is the one that sets typical performance or normative performance. This is another characterization trying to look at how autism and psychosis might be distributed along a particular continuum. Here they were interested in adaptive environment, looking at sensory-driven choice versus model-driven choice. And if you have balance, this is where most of the general population will have. Importantly, however, that this model assumes a trade-off relationship, meaning that you cannot have one and both of them at the same time. In other words, one will exist at the expense of the other one. So you cannot have autism and psychosis at the same time. However, epidemiological data suggests that this is problematic because we do have quite extensive data suggesting that on average, people with autism might qualify for a diagnosis with schizophrenia. And similarly, even at higher rates, we have quite a nice portion of the people with schizophrenia will actually have also qualify for the diagnosis of autism. So the question is, what do we do with this data? How do we actually try to understand the relation between autism and psychosis, assuming that these two conditions can exist in the same individual? So we proposed a model whereby we suggest that there might be genetic liability or risk that predisposes the individual to schizophrenia. Another one that basically predisposes people for autism. And importantly, we have here these two lines. One is the solid line and the dotted line. The solid line suggests that there's equal risk for both autism and psychosis. And the dotted line suggests that there are basically a relative dominance for autism. Here, like you have people have mainly schizophrenia and very little autism. And here we have the reverse of that. Using this type of model, we think we'll be able to actually provide a much better understanding and deeper understanding, respecting of the data that is available to see how autism and psychosis actually affect an outcome. In data that we obtained from the DECODE program in Iceland, we obtained a number of CNVs, copy number variants. These are basically bits of the genome that could be either deleted or duplicated. And with this deletion or duplicated, each of those copy number variants will have increased risk for either autism or schizophrenia. And what we found is that when we look at the risk ratio for schizophrenia and for autism, we found that these sets of copy number variants, these genomic loci, are actually have less effect on the impairing that these CNVs associated on social functioning. So social functioning is actually least prevalent or obvious in individuals who have those type of CNVs that have equal risk for autism and psychosis. But it is actually quite impaired in individuals who are actually biased toward autism or biased toward psychosis. Now, what do we do with this data? Now, each CNV can have any number between 10, 20, 30, 40 genes. And what can we do in order to actually zoom into those type of CNVs, just trying to understand what type of mechanism might actually predispose the individual to either autism or psychosis. So we took a specific SNP in a condition called Prader-Willis syndrome. What's unique about Prader-Willis syndrome, it can actually co-occur with either autism or psychosis. And what we found is that this particular SNP, depending on the genotype that the individual have, if you have a CC versus a CT versus a TT, you'll see that there is a shift in the bias from higher paranoia to higher autism. So people who have TT carrier versus CCT carrier are on the opposite end of the autism paranoia, the psychosis autism spectrum. We wanted to go a little bit further, and we obtained data from the Imagine consortium, which is basically a large consortium of about 2,000 youth who were genotyped. We took their genetic data and we calculated their polygenic risk scores for both autism and schizophrenia, and trying to see to what extent those polygenic risk scores actually affect SRS score, which is basically social impairment severity, autistic social impairment severity. There are two lines here which are important in this model. Again, this is the dotted line, which is the blue dotted line, and we have the red line. The blue dotted line reflects the relative dominance of polygenic risk or genetic liability for either autism or psychosis. And the red line is the one that shows a balanced liability for both autism and psychosis. And what we found is a significant effect for this blue line, suggesting that, as you would expect, higher genetic liability for autism will be associated with higher autistic severity. But that is dependent on the relative genetic liability you have for schizophrenia. So people who have low genetic liability for autism and have high psychosis have the least expression autistic traits. What we can do now that we have this polygenic risk scores calculated for this particular cohort, we wanted to look at those specific SNPs that were actually used in the calculation of the polygenic risk scores. And we did a gene ontology analysis. And this is just one slide that we just done recently, which is allow us to actually identify first what these SNPs belong to which particular genes, and what these genes are seemingly responsible for what type of biological processes. And what I would like to point out here that we found that the autism SNPs that were calculated in the polygenic risk scores seem to be enriched for synaptic transmission glutamatergic function, which is excitability. And conversely, in schizophrenia, we have them being enriched for synaptic transmission for inhibition of GABAergic functioning. So we think that this relationship, between autism and psychosis, might be precipitated by biological processes at the synaptic level, where excitation and inhibition dynamics might set the balance between autism and schizophrenia. So what do we conclude? So co-occurring autistic trait and schizophrenia feature can synergistically and sub-additively affect outcome. Modeling the patterns of the relationships between shared autism and schizophrenia risk factors should be a research priority if we are serious about personalized treatment. And thirdly, co-occurring conditions that are modulated by anti-correlative processes like inhibition, excitation, may usher a new research area of reciprocal therapies. I think the relationship between autism and psychosis is quite complex. This type of research, we don't think of it as being a replacement of the current research that is taking place, but we think it is an important complement because it allows us to see things that will not be possible by looking just at autism or psychosis independent of one another. So thank you for your attention. I would like to also thank my colleagues, Majd Weli, Yara Hussein, Shanice Stern at the Shanice Stern Lab at the University of Haifa, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any. Thank you.